There has been a great deal of debate on the American empire, starting with the question, does it exist? Or has it ever existed? Is it an empire? Or is it some new hybrid creature that resembles an empire? How is it different from the great European empires of the 19th century? These are questions that continue to be debated, but infrequently, because on American campuses today there is no real systematic study of the empire. Imperial studies as a subject, as a discipline, doesn't exist precisely because of the debates that have been taking place. But Thomas Jefferson and other founding fathers of the Republic were pretty clear as to what they would have to do in order to hold their own in a new world of which they were now becoming a part. Thomas Jefferson, for instance, said in a letter to a US minister in France, "Our people are decided in the opinion that it is necessary for us to take a share in the occupation of the ocean, and their established habits induce them to require that the sea be kept open to them, and that line of policy be pursued which will render the use of that element as great as possible to them." But what will be the consequence? Frequent wars, without a doubt. So Jefferson and others who succeeded him had absolutely no doubt that in order to exist, the United States of America, from the very beginning, had to mimic the enemy that it had defeated, and that enemy was the British Empire. So all the habits that they had picked up from the British Empire were in fact utilized first internally and then, as time passed, externally. And the result of that today is very clearly visible in the US command map. The world with US commanders' area of responsibility. You look at that map and you get a picture of what a global empire is like. Because when they use the word command, what they are effectively meaning is that these are the command structures in place for rapid or well-orchestrated military interventions when necessary. And the function of these military interventions is effectively to protect the economic and political interests of the United States on a global scale. Because we are today in a very interesting phase of world politics, something very unique. And that uniqueness can be summed up in the following sentence, that this is the first time in the history of humanity that one single empire dominates the globe, that it is, in fact, a global empire. And whether people like it or not, that is a reality they have to live with. This doesn't mean, and shouldn't be taken to mean, that there are no setbacks, that it's all been smooth sailing, that everything that has happened over the last 140, 130 years has been fine, perfect. No empire is fine and perfect. Each and every empire in recent history has had to fight to keep its place, and that applies to the United States as well. But its big triumph came in the 1990s when the Soviet Union and that entire world that it represented collapsed. What this resulted in was making that entire market now open and available to global capitalism, not just in Russia itself and Eastern Europe, but also in the largest country in the world, China, which, despite the fact that it continued to be ruled by the Communist Party, was now engaging in capitalism. And not just engaging, but becoming extremely powerful. So if one were to ask what are the two most significant changes in the 21st century, I would say first, the emergence of the United States as a global empire, and secondly, the fact that the center of the world market has shifted eastwards. China, the Far Eastern Bloc are now central to the functioning of the capitalist globe, and any big explosions or upheavals there will affect the whole globe. But does that mean automatically that because the center of the world market has shifted to the Far East, political power, global power, military power, and even economic power as such has shifted in that direction? Here the answer is no, that there has been a huge change, but this change, curiously enough, has till now not damaged or dented but reinforced US hegemony, because it was the United States that took a decision as early as the late 60s, then further worked on in the 70s to split China from Russia, to encourage that gap, and to back China in its huge conflict with the Soviet Union. And this they succeeded in doing, so the Chinese were given enormous openings, economic and political openings on a global scale to do what they've done, which is why industrial production as such has moved largely to China. It's hardly a country in the world which one visits where you don't see goods made in China, which has boosted the Chinese economy phenomenally on one particular level. But if the question is asked, is the Chinese economy capable of competing on a high-tech level? And the answer has to be no, because the greatest invention, if you like, or the greatest economic advance which was made in the United States in technological advance was on the West Coast with the invention of the internet, with the emergence of computers and the transformation of communications. So all the key areas of the economy which affects the entire world have been developed in the United States, and the United States, despite deindustrialization, remains a strong economic power, controlling or owning some of the world's largest global corporations. So to write off the United States is too easy. If we look, for instance, at what is going on in political terms, is US control really being challenged? I'm not sure. Occasionally it has, but the military power of the United States is so huge today that it dwarfs every single country. If one looks at the figures speak for themselves. From 2001 to 2010, the Department of Defense's military budget, just think about this, of $533 billion grew by 80%. So from 9/11 onwards, 9/11, which Condoleezza Rice, the National Security Advisor of George Bush, said we should now use this to get our way in the world, which of course they attempted to do with partial success, but effectively what that did was to enhance the military budget. So in a world in which initially we were told there were no longer enemies, that this was in fact a capitalist world, Russia was capitalist, China was capitalist, capitalism had conquered the world, we were told there would be a peace dividend, so people could live in peace and democracy would triumph everywhere. Instead, we've had a situation of continuous wars, with the US trying constantly to reassert its hegemony. The fact that it can't be challenged militarily on the air or on the sea is obvious, because the military budget of the United States exceeds that of virtually every other country in the world, major country in the world put together. And the fact is that the budget has been increasing by amazing amounts in contrast to the period of the Cold War from 1917 to 1990, when the US military budget was much, much lower, despite the fact that they had this grand enemy, supposedly, on a world scale. The military budget was lower than it is today. So what is the function of this budget? In my opinion, the function of this huge military budget is the preservation of US hegemony, mastery of the world, and, you know, they will not do it totally stupidly as they sometimes do, as in Iraq and Afghanistan. They can't behave in the same way vis-à-vis China, but they still have a network of what we could call vassal states, or as the Chinese put it more colorfully, flunky states. And that is the name the Chinese have tended to give to Japan, which they say so many years after the Second World War, after being nuked, after being driven into the ground, still remains a US flunky state. And only recently, Barack Obama visited Australia to cut the tape on a new military presence near Perth, from where they can have easy access to monitoring China. So they are not stopping or pulling back. In fact, they are constantly advancing. And there's only one reason for this, which is to make sure that no one is capable of challenging them. So let's accept that a military challenge to the United States is virtually impossible today. A power that decided to attack the United States would be crushed, destroyed, nuked. All that is left then is for small actors, not attached to any state at all, to effectively carry out small acts of terror, which in terms of economic or military you know, sort of from that point of view, from an economic and a military point of view, are pinpricks. The notion that 9/11 damaged the United States militarily or economically is not the case. It damaged them psychologically because they were not prepared for an attack on their own soil. Though many serious foreign policy thinkers within the United States itself, very senior academics, people like Chalmers Johnson, who once had been a CIA consultant during the early Cold War years, spoke Japanese, very, very knowledgeable about China, later became an academic, was the first foreign policy intellectual in the United States to warn them that if they carried on the way they were doing, and the way they were behaving to other peoples and other countries, sooner or later there would be what he called a blowback. And Chalmers predicted that this blowback would not come from a state deciding to make war on the United States of America, but by independent actors outside the control of any state. This book, Blowback, was written exactly a year before 9/11, which it predicted with clinical efficiency. So it is not that no warnings were given, but these warnings were by and large ignored. And that has been a huge problem now in the United States, that serious debate probably takes place on some levels, but within the public sphere and within the public domain, much of these debates have come to an end. So let's conclude the first section by accepting that the United States is not militarily challengeable, either on land or on the sea or in the air. Is it politically challengeable? Can it be confronted politically? Here the picture is different. The challenges that have come, the serious political challenges, have come not from areas which are generally regarded as friendly to the United States, areas like, for instance, Western Europe, areas like the newly incorporated states of Eastern Europe, which moved without too many problems from being satellite states of the former Soviet Union to being satellite states of the United States of America. At the time when the Berlin Wall came down, the United States leaders had promised the Russian leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, that if he agreed to the peaceful reunification of Germany, there would be no eastward expansion of NATO. This is the pledge Gorbachev was given, which he foolishly accepted without asking for any guarantees in return. And if you look at the map, you will see that the expansion of NATO eastwards has been systematic and regular. And this expansion of NATO is finally what led to a confrontation, a small-scale confrontation, political confrontation between Putin's Russia and Obama's America, centered on the Ukraine. But without understanding the history of that confrontation, it is difficult to understand what is taking place in the Ukraine, that the Russian patience finally snapped, and they said if the Americans can behave like this all over the world, we are certainly going to behave like this where we are, around our borders, because this genuinely affects our national and defense interests. Of course, a negotiated settlement is taking place. So in terms of America's political allies, the European continent, by which, of course, I mean its elites and its politicians, are firmly in the bag. Britain, where I happen to live, has been a vassal state now of the United States for many, many years, certainly since the time of Margaret Thatcher, but a process which began before that in 1956 during the Suez Crisis, when it became clear that Britain was not going to be able to play an independent role without asking for US permission. And this view of Britain was expressed very clearly when Tony Blair was Prime Minister and told the newly appointed British ambassador to the United States, who came to Downing Street to ask for instructions, and Blair's chief of staff told him, "Your job is to stay in the arse of the White House and not to move." And this particular position now can be applied more or less to most European countries. So any notion of Europe becoming an independent power bloc with its own political ideas, with its own social programs, is gone and dead, which is one reason why Europe itself is confronting today what we can only describe as a huge social, political, and economic crisis. If that is the case as far as Europe is concerned, what of Africa? Here was a continent that fought for its freedom, its liberation, and its independence. One of the largest and richest countries in Africa, the Congo, won independence under a nationalist leader, Patrice Lumumba, in 1962. It has now been admitted by the State Department that this elected leader was executed on the orders of President Eisenhower, who thought he was not friendly enough to Washington. Since that time, Africa has been engaged in struggles of various sorts, the last of which was the defeat of apartheid. But it is now part of an imperial relay system. In 2007, AFRICOM was set up as the US command post for seeing and monitoring and intervening in Africa. Today, 7 years later, 49 out of 55 countries in the African continent have a US military presence. So Africa, Asia, Europe, very much under the sway of imperial hegemony. What about the rest of the world? I think In Asia, in particular, the key countries for the United States are China, India, Japan, and as a footnote to these three, the Korean Peninsula. Here, the United States is not worried by any military threat from China. What it is worried by is a growing nationalist intensity in Japan, where Japanese people are beginning to ask, so many years after the Second World War, why is there a big US base in Okinawa? Why is it the case that American soldiers who are arrested raping local women, Japanese women, cannot be tried in a Japanese court? Why is it that Japan still has less sovereignty than even Germany? And these questions are going to provoke some explosion sooner or later, but till now, effectively, the Japanese remain loyal to the United States. They do not have an independent foreign policy and are not permitted one. The other flunky state, of course, is South Korea, where the United States dominates, has a large military base, and has stymied in recent years any attempts by the two Koreas to unite. The reason for this was given to me once in a public debate I had with the leading advisor to Donald Rumsfeld when he was Defense Secretary. I asked her, why are you effectively stopping the reunification of Korea? And she said, I'll tell you why. This was off the record, behind the scenes, not in public. She said, you should see the gleam in the South Korean generals' eyes when they think of reunification, because what they think about is that a unified Korea will be a nuclear state. She said, if China is a nuclear state, if a unified Korea is a nuclear state, how can we stop the Japanese from becoming a nuclear state? And if we can't, and the Japanese, the Koreans, and the Chinese all have nuclear weapons and nuclear status in the Far East, that affects our interests adversely. More or less saying that the only way to be a sovereign state in these days is to be a nuclear power. And that was the first time someone senior from the American policy establishment had explained to me why they were opposing the reunification of Korea. So it's not that they get everything their own way in that region, but by and large, Asia as a whole has not proved problematic for the United States. So small problems in Europe with the Russians, but by and large Europe pacified. Close links with both flunky states and non-flunky states, including the unified state of Vietnam, where a large war was once fought. And uneasy, but by and large controlled relations with the People's Republic of China. If there has been a strong political opposition and a fight for sovereignty, it has come from South America. It started with the election of the Bolivarians in Venezuela, when the late Hugo Chavez was first elected president. Attempts to overthrow him, backed by the United States and Spain, and local reaction failed. And Chavez emerged stronger and stronger and stronger. And this strength to resist the empire, the big empire, set off a chain reaction in South America. It was followed by Ecuador, by Bolivia, by Paraguay. Even the Brazilians, who were economically closer to Washington, politically said, we are no longer going to be used in order to destabilize our neighboring republics. They are our brother and sister republics. And so South America, once regarded as the backyard of the United States, sealed off from the rest of the world by the Monroe Doctrine, now emerged as probably the most independent-minded continent in the whole world. And what that shows, to my mind, is that politics, political alternatives, and political pressures and political unity can play a very important part in weakening and isolating aggressive tendencies in American imperial policies. It has not been possible for them, though they haven't given up trying, to try and win back or get back the whole of South America. They haven't succeeded. Venezuela is key for them because it's the largest oil producer in the Americas, and that these are countries which they don't like getting out of control. Iraqi oil is privatized, Libyan oil is privatized, Iran's oil remains under state control, and Venezuela's oil is not only under state control, but it is being used to build schools, hospitals, educate a population, provide subsidized housing, etc. So in a world which is by and large dominated and hegemonized by the United States, the resistance, political, because that's the only form possible, unless a country is occupied, comes from South America. And I think that there is a lesson here for other parts of the world. In the European elections, some of the leaders of the anti-elite parties, the people on the left, actually suggested, like Alex Tsipras, the leader of Syriza in Greece, that maybe we should follow the South American model. Why not? And when asked who was your favorite politician ever, he said Hugo Chavez, which shows that slowly some of the lessons from that continent, which still has many problems, are seeping through and reaching other parts of the world. So how long can the United States exist as an empire? I think at least for this century. How do empires fall? Empires fall when they fight each other. Basically, I'm talking about modern empires. The European empires brought themselves down by fighting 2 world wars. The First World War, which knocked out 6 empires, the Germans, the Turks, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, basically wiped out. New empires moved in, situation remained unstable, another world war took place, also about imperial possessions, though not exclusively, and the conclusion of the Second World War brought about a fall of the British, French empires, the 2 big European empires, and slowly the Belgian one as well, leaving the United States in a dominant position. That position, as I argued at the beginning of this lecture, has now become more and more dominant. How will it all end? Let us return to my old friend, Chalmers Johnson. In his last book in his trilogy, Nemesis, The Last Days of the American Republic, Chalmers wrote, specifically, I believe that to maintain our empire abroad requires resources and commitments that will inevitably undercut our domestic democracy, and in the end produce a military dictatorship or its civilian equivalent. The founders of our nation understood this well and tried to create a form of government, a republic, that would prevent this from occurring. But the combination of huge standing armies, almost continuous wars, military Keynesianism, and ruinous military expenses have destroyed our republican structure in favor of an imperial presidency. We are on the cusp of losing our democracy for the sake of keeping our empire. Once a nation is started down that path, the dynamics that apply to all empires come into play. Isolation, overstretch, the uniting of forces opposed to imperialism, and bankruptcy. Nemesis stalks our life as a free nation. I think Chalmers may well be right on this, but there is one thing we have to bear in mind, that for the American empire to be brought down and dismantled as an empire, it needs the American citizens to be active. Without the intervention of American citizens in the political life of their country and its future, the American empire, I fear, could go on for much longer than even Chalmers Johnson thought.